Let's move on to the third section, the four key people during the king's period. Samuel anointed the first king of Israel, Saul. 1 Samuel 9:2 describes Saul as an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. Saul had a lot of things going for him. Nevertheless, Saul was not wise and only partially obeyed God. Due to his disobedience, God rejected him as king. God then instructed Samuel to anoint a young boy to be king in Saul's place, David. David was the youngest of his brothers, so Samuel initially did not think that he was the right choice to be king. But God told Samuel that the boy's heart was more important than his outward features. God chose David to be king because, unlike Saul, David was a man after God's own heart. God revealed to David that it was through his line that the promise of Abraham would be fulfilled, and that David's kingdom would be established forever. This promise had its true fulfillment in the birth of Christ, who was born of the lineage of both David and Abraham. The first step of the fulfillment of God's promise came when David's son, Solomon, took the throne. Solomon was the wisest Israelite king to ever live. He was also the most wealthy. However, Solomon eventually disobeyed God and worshipped idols. As a result of Solomon's disobedience, the kingdom split into a northern nation of Israel and a southern nation of Judah. There were 39 kings who reigned during the time of the divided kingdom. About half of these kings reigned in the north and about half of them reigned in the south. Most of these kings reigned during a time when the people strayed from God. The prophets repeatedly warned the people that unless they turned back to God, they would be conquered by a foreign nation. Eventually, the northern nation of Israel was conquered by the Assyrians. The southern nation of Judah was conquered by the Babylonians. So we have our next four links in the chain, the four key people during the king's period: Saul, David, Solomon, and the 39 kings of the divided nation. Are you similar to any of these people? Are you someone who is similar to Saul? You have a lot going for you in this world. You have good looks and your talents are off the chart. You can be greatly used by God if you're willing to obey Him. Saul disobeyed God and his kingship was taken away from him. Will you obey God and use what God has given you for His purposes? Are you similar to Saul? Or maybe you are more like David. David was in some ways the opposite of Saul. He was not a head taller and greater than all the rest. Rather, David was the youngest among his brothers, and was not what the world around him considered to be a, quote, good leader. Yet God did not care about the outside, but only cared that David's heart wanted to serve God. Maybe you too don't fit the part of being a leader on the outside according to the world's standards. Maybe you're not good looking, or maybe you do not have the talents that others have. Are you similar to David? Perhaps you are more like Solomon. Maybe you're someone who is extremely smart. You have more degrees than most people have fingers on their hand. God used Solomon greatly until Solomon fell away from him. Will you stay close to God and use the intelligence that God has given you for His purposes? Are you similar to Solomon? Or maybe you are like the 39 kings of the divided nation. Maybe you're in a leadership position, but things are not going so well. Maybe things are not going well because you are not being a good leader. Or maybe things are not going well because the people under you are not following you. God can turn things around if you're willing to turn to Him. Are you like those 39 kings? God used each of these people despite their failures and faults, despite their backgrounds and life situations. If you are similar to these people, God can use you too. The final group is made up of 6 key people. 5 of these key people will round out our chronological trip through the Old Testament. The last key person has a broader impact that we will discuss in a moment. We pick up our story with the people being taken to Babylon as slaves. One of the people taken to Babylon was a man named Daniel. Daniel was both a prophet and a leader of the enslaved Israelite people during the 70 years they were in Babylon. Daniel served in the court of the Babylonian kings and had to learn the delicate balance between serving God, honoring the Babylonian king, and avoiding the political landmines of the Babylonian court. Daniel served in this capacity until the Persians eventually conquered the Babylonians. Soon after the Persians took control, the Persian king allowed the Jewish people to return to the Promised Land. Zerubbabel, a prince of Judah, was one of the first leaders to lead a group of Jews on the long trip back to the land of Israel. When Zerubbabel's group arrived, they found the city of Jerusalem in ruins. Zerubbabel led the people to start a new life in this place despite the challenges of living in a war-torn city. Specifically, Zerubbabel led the people to rebuild the temple that the Babylonians had destroyed. Not all the Jewish people went back to the Promised Land, though. Some stayed behind in Persia, formerly called Babylon. Esther, a young Jewish girl, was one of those Jewish people who stayed behind in Persia. Esther was chosen to be queen by the Persian king Xerxes, but Xerxes did not know Esther was a Jew. Soon a plot was formed to exterminate the Jews. Esther realized that God had put her in this authority position for, quote, such a time as this. Esther then risked her life to save her people. After the time of Esther, a scholarly priest named Ezra led another group of Jews back to the Promised Land. Ezra could have stayed and used his impressive skills in Persia. Nevertheless, he went to serve the people in Jerusalem, a people who needed his skills the most. Ezra became the spiritual leader for this, quote, frontier people living in Jerusalem. About 15 years after Ezra arrived in Jerusalem, a Jew named Nehemiah led another group of Jews back from Persia. Nehemiah was a high official in the Persian court. The Persian king probably allowed Nehemiah to return to Jerusalem so that he could secure the border between the land of Israel, which was Persian territory, and Egypt. Nehemiah became the governor of the group of Jews living in Jerusalem and led the people to rebuild the wall and the fortifications surrounding Jerusalem. The final key person on our list was really a group of key people. These key people were the prophets. The prophets were people that God raised up to encourage and inspire the people of Israel to return to God. They might be similar to pastors or preachers today. These prophets served the people from the time of the United Monarchy, or the time of Saul, David, and Solomon, all the way to the post-exile period, or the time after the Babylonian slavery. Because many of the people were illiterate, these prophets often had to use creative techniques to teach the people the truth about God. And so here are our last 6 links in the chain of key people: Daniel, Zerubbabel, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the prophets. Are you similar to any of these people? Think about Daniel. Daniel had to walk the political tightrope of the Babylonian court. Do you ever have to walk a delicate balancing act of following God and still doing what your boss at work tells you what to do? Or maybe you have to do the same balancing act in your family. Are you similar to Daniel? Or how about Zerubbabel? Zerubbabel led the people to live in a place that had been ruined by war. Have you ever had to serve in a place that was not easy? Maybe you served in the armed forces overseas in Afghanistan or Iraq and saw with your own eyes the devastation of war. Are you similar to Zerubbabel? Or maybe you are like Esther. Esther was a young girl who was thrust into a leadership position because of the urgency of her time. Are you in the midst of an urgent crisis in your city, your school, your work, or even your family? Has God placed you in a position where you can change things, almost as if He has put you in that position for, quote, such a time as this? Are you similar to Esther? Or perhaps you are more like Ezra. You're highly educated and highly skilled, but you also care about the things of God. Like Ezra, you have a choice to make. Will you use those skills in a place where you will be comfortable, or will you take the hard road to a far-off place where the people need you the most? Will you be the doctor that serves the poor in the Middle East, or the engineer who digs water wells for villages in Africa? Are you similar to Ezra? Or maybe you are like Nehemiah, the man who rebuilt the wall around Jerusalem. You're a leader and a craftsman, a person who is good with your hands. Will you use your skills to fix the car of the young single mom who desperately needs to find a way to get to work? Will you use your skills to rebuild the houses of hurricane victims who have lost everything? Are you similar to Nehemiah? Finally, you might be like the prophets. These people were from all walks of life, and they consistently encouraged the people to serve God. Specifically, they often had to use creative means and illustrations to teach the people because most of the people were illiterate. Are you a creative person? Are you someone who communicates ideas through art, design, and media? Will you use those abilities to bring people back to God? Are you similar to the prophets? God used each of these people despite their failures and faults, despite their backgrounds and life situations. If you are similar to these people, God can use you too.